Speaker, Hannah Mansell from the British Woodworking Federation, Head of Technical Research and Insight, spokesperson for the Fire Door Safety Week campaign, which I'm sure she'll talk about in a minute. She also chairs the Passive Fire Protection Forum, which is a forum group of trade associations in passive fire protection, and she's a trustee of the Children's Burns Trust. Hannah, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to do a really quick whistle-stop tour into fire doors, and I expect that there are probably, well, in fact, I know that there are experts in this room on fire doors myself, who I know from other meetings and things. So I hope this gives you a broad sort of brush overview of fire doors, but also provides you with some links to further information if you'd like to find out some more. Okay, right, so that's me. As Niall says, you know, we come across quite a lot of these photos involved in quite a lot of investigations after there are fires. And we commonly see passive fire protection and fire doors doing their job. But of course, these are quite complex products, and people sort of think, oh, it's just a door, it's like any other door. And they don't really appreciate that actually, when it comes to fire doors, there's kind of a different set of rules that we need to play by. So we've talked about passive fire protection, but when we're actually talking about fire doors, of course, this very long word, compartmentalisation, it's very, very simple, just to hold the fire and the smoke in one place and delay its spread around the building. So that's, of course, particularly important in buildings where I might have a stay-put fire plan. Either the building is too complex in design, or I've got a high volume of residents in there, so I'm not going to be able to do an evacuation quickly. So that's one scenario where fire doors play an important role. But of course, the other role is that you'll find fire doors in pretty much every building that we work, sleep, where we dropped the kids off this morning. And they're commonly overlooked. And one of their main roles is to keep that means of escape route out of your building safe, to keep it protected. And of course, that's the same route that we expect the emergency services to be able to access the building with as well. So really critical that we keep it safe. Another point is that many people kind of overlook the role that fire doors play in delaying the spread of cold smoke around a building. As many of you know, it's the smoke that will usually get you long before the fire does. So that's kind of the secret life of a fire door, because we don't often see them doing that, and people generally aren't interested in fire doors doing that sort of role. So in everyday purposes, there are other performance requirements associated with fire doors. They've got to, you know, look good, various security, thermal, acoustic, etc., durability, accessibility. So in actual fact, as you can see, like all of a sudden these products that everyone thinks, oh, it's just such a simple thing, it's just a door. They're actually quite complex, because we need to make these things all work hand in hand. And of course, for a long time, you know, it's not just we want them to work for a week. They're often in place for years in buildings. So I'm not going to read my way through this list, but I think the kind of point that I want you to take away from this slide is that fire doors are a system of components, and they all work hand in hand. Now, if I just get one of those details wrong, and some of those details on there seem like relatively small things, a bit of signage, an eye viewer, this kind of thing, the gaps around the door, in actual fact, they can have an enormous impact on the performance of that door. So where we've got that system of components all working hand in hand, wherever I've got my weakest link, that is the weakest link. That is where it's going to fail. And of course, what happens if you get it wrong? Probably, again, I don't need to read my way through this list, but we need to consider the safety of the occupants of the building, plus the safety of the emergency services who are responding to our call. Now, if I've got a legal responsibility for looking after the fire doors, specifying, installing, etc., whatever part of the fire door chain I've come in, if I get that wrong and it's proved that I got it wrong, then I can be looking at an imprisonment or a fine under the RRO. From an insurance perspective, and again, there are some insurance experts in the room, I'm sure we'll talk on this in more detail, but your property and your possessions may not be protected properly if you haven't kept your fire safety standards in your building up to scratch. And I always think that kind of 0.5 on this list, if I'm worrying about 0.1 to 4, your risk to reputation kind of falls quite low on my list of worries. But it's probably something to think about, particularly for some of the colleagues who are in here who I know represent very, very large organisations. Okay. So I expect some of my other colleagues a bit later on are going to talk a bit more about third-party certification, but I think it'd be worth, just at this point, whizzing through kind of 3 basic scenarios that I commonly see fire doors presented in the market as. So the first one is self-declaration, and that's really just me rolling up and saying, yes, Gov, it's a fire door. And everyone says, oh, that's Hannah, she's been making fire doors for 50 years. Of course she knows what she's doing. Never really been asked to prove it, never really had to, probably haven't had that product tested, etc., etc. So as you can imagine, that's an extremely dangerous way to trade, and that's a big load of risk that I'm passing over to the next person in the supply chain if I'm going to work that way. So the second way is as a test report, and people get very excited by a test report. I get hundreds of these things coming past my desk. But the thing to remember about a test report is it's just that. It's a snapshot of what I got that day when I took my product to the test. And I might test under British, European standards, whichever test schedule I tested it under. But it's just a snapshot. It doesn't mean that I can go back to my factory premises, my manufacturing premises, and make a product which is consistently of the same specification and quality to be able to achieve the same performance when I take it for test. Now, as I say, people get quite excited by test reports because often what happens, these are documents which are many, many pages long. People take a quick look at the front page, see that it says fire door test, it's got a nice stamp on the front of it as well, and they assume that everything is, let's use the word, in place for it, sort of thing. But it's really the scrutiny of that test report that you need to get to grips with, because I need to understand, when was the test taken? Does it apply to the product I'm actually being supplied now? I often see these things very out of date, but the test report is really useful because it tells me the exact parameters that the product was tested, and also it talks about the different components that we use. So back to that way of thinking of fire doors as a system, it will start to list all of the components so that I can make sure that I can check those off later. But as I say, sort of trading on a test report, there are various risks that need to be recognised with that, and just think that it only really provides you with part of the jigsaw puzzle in understanding your product. So what we also have is third-party certification, and third-party certification isn't just for fire doors, it can be for products or it can be for services as well. And well, I guess it does what it says on the tin, third-party certification. We've got an independent third party who's coming around, making sure that the manufacturers are, they're regularly testing the product for starters, they're auditing the manufacturing premises to make sure that I've got all of those really strict production controls in place so that I can't let my specification dilute. I'm not going to make mistakes. If I've got any defective product, I can quarantine it and remove it from the supply chain before it even enters the market. So there are many different layers of protection that third-party certification provides. I know that one of my colleagues is going to talk in a lot more detail, but one of the really essential things I think is useful to mention is that it provides traceability of product. So not only do I know when a product was made and who made it and what products went into making that product, I know exactly where it's got to in the market, what the scale of the issue is. So consequently, if there is a problem, that's a really useful thing to have that product traceability, so I can take a call on what the scale of the problem is and start to try and locate them. So sort of third-party certification, it does add these extra layers of protection that we talk about. Oh, okay. Niall is holding up signs telling me to be quicker, so I'm just going to whiz through these. I've talked about them, about thinking of our products as systems, but think of, I often talk about compatible products. Sorry, I don't know why this is whizzing ahead. I hope it pauses now. Compatible products, now these really, in simple terms, these are what is listed on my test report and within my third-party certification, and it's the recipe for making my door. If I step outside of that recipe and I use an incompatible product, number one, I can chuck my third-party certification and all of that guarantees that I can pass on to my client in the bin because I've broken certification. But more importantly, I may not have any way of knowing that that product is going to work. So when I talk about these compatible components, I've talked about that big long list of all the components that work hand in hand. And again, by making just a small mistake on one of those, and people don't intentionally go out to make mistakes, but specification gets diluted for all sorts of reasons, people trying to save a few quid on etc., etc. So things to be aware of, but test reports and third-party certification give me that steps back to the original recipe so that I can make those checks when I'm, particularly if the product is already installed on site as part of its regular inspection and maintenance. Okay, so the next few slides is just whizzing through a few of the key elements of fire doors. So the first one being the fire door leaf. Lots of people, when I talk about fire doors, they think I'm just talking about the leaf. The thing to remember is that a lot of testing timber fire doors has come on a lot in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, and there is a vast range of product and different specifications out there to really suit any customer desire. So it's very rare that actually you have to step outside and start risking using product which hasn't been properly tested and isn't properly audited. So a vast range of product, but it's really, really important, again, to make those steps back to the original certificate, to the test report, because there are all sorts of limitations that are associated with these products. I can't go to any size, I can't go up to the ceiling, I can't just add a window where I want to, I can't just add a letter plate. I need to make sure, again, that I'm working within the specification, which all leads back to how the product was originally tested and audited by the third party. Glazed apertures. So often people say to me, I need to put a bit of fireglass in this door. Now, no. It's not all about the glass. Okay, don't get me wrong, the piece of glass I select is integral to making this system work. But think of it as a glazed system of components, again, working hand in hand. Now, when we get down to glazed apertures, you'll be surprised at the kind of level of detail that we really get to. Even things like the angle that I put in the fixings of the bead, the spacer blocks, tiny, tiny details that you can't see unless you start ripping doors apart. These are all really integral to making that system work. So when you get someone who might just think, it's all right, I can whack a hole in that door, no worries, actually all of a sudden there's really quite a lot of checks that you should be doing in the background to make sure that you're actually even able to do that. So as I say, quite complicated to get right. I expect I'm teaching my grandmother how to suck eggs with this slide, but just to kind of sort of basic information. Obviously, when I've got a product which I've tested to the British standards, we refer to this as an FD30, FD60. The number is telling me how many minutes that product is going to pass. So obviously FD30, 30 minutes, etc. Just as a point, when I've tested to the European standards, I will see these classifications as an E30, E60. They're kind of the common ones that we find. If we go and visit operating theatre in a local hospital or something like that, we're likely to find sort of 8-hour fire doors, because of course if the building catches fire and I'm doing a massive surgery, I don't want to have to leave. I need to finish that surgery, and the passive fire protection of that building would keep me safe. Just at the bottom of this slide, I've got an example of a fire door label. Now, depending on which third-party certification scheme, there are different ways of providing traceability. But sort of in a nutshell, this label will provide me with who manufactured the door originally. There's a unique traceability number for that exact door. It tells me the CF number, so that's my fire certificate number, and it will also tell me the rating. But if I'm out on site and I'm inspecting a door and I come across one of those labels or equivalent traceability marks, it means I can make those steps back to the original fire certificate. I can contact the manufacturer, and then I can use that information to make my checks and make sure that that door that is installed on site is still up to scratch and within specification as well. Now, when I talk about fire doors, always banging on about fire doors, but probably 95% of the time I'm actually talking about a fire and smoke control door. So this is sort of, again, a small detail, but it means a lot, particularly when we sort of have already recognised what a danger smoke is in a building. And again, just from the point of actually classifying these things, it's only this tiny little S after my minute rating, as it were, my resistance, which tells me that it's a smoke door as well. But really important for people that are involved in like the specification, the procurement of these products. Again, small details, but it's the ones that count. The frame or lining, I've had loads of people phone me up in the last few months and say, we're thinking of upgrading our doors to FD60s. Building regs only calls for FD30, but we want to provide these extra layers of protection. And I'm like, well, you know, building regulations, the approved documents, that's guidance. You can choose to do that if you want to, sort of taking on board lots and lots of other factors. But I say to them, well, what are you doing about the frame and the lining? And they say, we're going to use the existing frame. Well, if I've got an FD30 frame or a 30-minute frame and I go and put a 60-minute door in, well, the weakest part is, of course, my frame. So again, a waste of money. And so these are just the points to consider about. Think about it as a complete system of components. And ironmongery, a big sort of umbrella term, but really I'm referring to everything in there, the pieces of ironmongery that actually hold the door in place in a fire. A timber fire door, when it's in a fire, it comes under enormous pressures and drafts and things like this. The timber door leaf will actually start to bow and warp, and all of these pieces of ironmongery, plus the intumescent seals and things, they're helping it to keep it robustly in that frame. Now, when it comes to ironmongery, it also applies to letter plates, eye viewers, even the signage. I might put a couple of door numbers on the front of my flat front door sort of thing. Again, it will all be listed into the certificate as to what I can and can't use. So again, that's kind of, the certificate is your friend. It makes it very, very easy to make sure that you maintain that compatibility of product. And here's just a tiny point for you as well. Of course, you know, big lump of metal in a fire, we know it gets very hot. But when we talk about timber fire doors, it will start to affect the material that is surrounding that big lump of metal. So my hinges, my closer, my lock and my latch. You'll often find additional intumescent protection used around these elements. And again, these are the tiny details that you don't really see unless you start pulling doors apart. But on my image there, you can see the small little pad behind the hinge plate. This is an example of intumescent protection which is added there to protect this element. Now, we commonly see these forgotten, left out, chucked away, etc. But as I say, a tiny point, and it makes it all work, as it were. Intumescent and smoke seals, again, just recognise that these are two separate things. The intumescent seals expand under heat and actually fill the gap around between your frame and your door. The smoke seals can be either combined with your intumescent seals or separate, and they're the ones that actually provide that to delay the travel of cold smoke through. So these are two separate things, and again, it's very easy to go in and see these on a fire door. As we walk out here, you'll see them on these fire doors, so you can always check them as you're really walking around your buildings. So we talk about who's responsible when it comes to fire doors. So it's not just the manufacturer, because the fire door supply chain is really intricate, and these products travel in all different directions and get used by lots and lots of different stakeholders in the chain. And the important thing to think about is taking on board that fact that there's so many people involved. If we've got this underlying level of traceability, it allows us to sort of hand over responsibly to the next person in that chain. So again, it doesn't matter where you appear in the chain. If I've got that element of traceability, I can go straight back to the manufacturer, straight back to the fire test certificate, back to the third-party certification organisation who did the original testing, and actually get my hands on the original documentation to accompany that product. Of course, particularly useful if I'm entering a new building, an existing building that I'm now responsible to look after the fire safety in. Okay, so how do we get it right? Often it's about nailing down the design and specification in the early stages. If I get my product on site and then all of a sudden decide, oh, I need a window in it, I need a letter plate, I need a cat flap, it becomes very, very costly and very risky to start doing that work on site. Again, you break certification and all the rest of it. So it's about really nailing that design at the beginning and asking all of those really critical questions. Believe me, it will cost you dearly if you leave it too late, as I expect that some people in the room are familiar with. Stick to the specification. So here really is what I'm talking about, is stick to the certification and that recipe behind the fire door. The minute that you step out of that, as I say, you break the certification, you know, okay, accepted. But we've got no proof of that product will perform if we step outside of it. Procurement, another area where specification is at danger from getting diluted. You know, colleagues in procurement are under a lot of pressure to save a little bit of money. They might be working with innovative products which are new on the market and all of these sort of things. It's not to say that they can't do their job well and do what is expected of them, but there's quite a lot of due diligence that should be undertaken behind the scenes as well to make sure that it's that you are able to do that. And of course, just to give a quick mention of installation, though I feel wrong to give it just a quick mention, the installation of fire door product is as important as the product itself. There are various installation guides. You can obviously reference them off our website later on. These are all free to download. But again, don't think about it like you're fitting any other door. One of the really critical points that often gets missed in installation is not just the very tight tolerances that you've got with fire doors, but also the fire stopping of the gap between the frame and the wall. This is the bit that's often covered by a piece of architrave, so really hard to inspect if you don't inspect it as it's being done. Okay, and of course a regular and robust regime of maintenance and inspection going on in your buildings. It's no good me going and fitting a door perfectly, walking away from it, because obviously wear and tear will start to affect its performance, and if you don't catch it quick enough, that's when we find that these problems manifest themselves into something much larger. Okay, so I'd just like to give a couple of sort of, further resources. So in 3 weeks' time is Fire Door Safety Week. Fire Door Safety Week is a national campaign that we've run now for the last 6 years. And the aim of the campaign is to really pick up as many supporters and stakeholders. So you don't have to be a manufacturer or anything like that to join in. If you want to check out the Fire Door Safety Week website, there's loads of free resources that everyone can use, access and use to actually roll out the messages of awareness to your own stakeholder group. So you're very, very welcome to access those. There will of course be a lot of other activities going around the campaign as well, lots of social media, etc. So I hope that gives you just a little taste of fire doors, as it were. Of course, I could talk to you for hours, but I expect I've done enough. Please come and talk to me in the break if you have any questions. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Niall.